Good evening, everybody. I know, yes, I'm extremely tired because it's been a really awesome last 2 days, and I'm probably the most tired person here because it took me about 4 hours to clear immigration, which is crazy, but yeah. So today I was told to come talk about some of the project that we've been running, I would say quite just around 6 years, and which is cool because like having to obviously come over here and hearing what people have been doing and, going to a bunch of open source conference. It just kind of makes sense to kind of reflect and talk about like what is the state of open source in Africa. But of course, I'm not coming to share the whole of Africa because I only live in Nigeria and I can only tell you a little bit about what my team and I have been doing for about 6 years. So a bit about me, I'm sure that was covered. I'm an open source advocate. I love doing stuff around open source program management. In my day job, I do DevRel, which is pretty cool. Not just about speaking at conferences, but also like doing really cool stuff. Okay, so why OSCAR? So OSCAR is a short way of saying the Open Source Community Africa. The reason we decided to stick with OSCAR is because sometimes people keep saying, oh, that name is so long. And of course, like on Twitter, it makes more sense to have something a little bit shorter. But again, like reflecting on the things we've been able to do in the last 6 years. About 6 years ago, I think 7, I had the opportunity to go to Mountain View on Google Summer of Code Mentor Summit. And just like any other conferences, there were just a lot of people that I saw, which is pretty cool. But on the context towards, my open source journey and people that are in the same region as mine was a little bit on the lower side. And then I asked the question, I'm like, oh, okay, why are there not like a lot of people coming from this part of the world over to conferences like this? And there were a lot of challenges that I learned from the summit, but also speaking as some bunch of project maintainers and people that run open source projects and like different challenges between traveling down to funding, down to even, getting visas, which is one of the most common conversations when it comes to traveling. So going back to Nigeria, or in this case, going back to Lagos, what I want to say is, we didn't eventually create the next big developers community. What we did instead was to identify what are those communities doing? And to be honest, there's a lot of them. It ranges from the Google over to Microsoft. I think on the Google side, there's a really large group called the Google Developers Group, which is really, really massive. From the Microsoft over to GitHub over to Meta. So there's a really huge community of developers that have been moving around ages in the continent of Africa. But the goal here was to make sure that we are not coming to create something new, but we're coming to form a voice, which is be more intentional about what it means to do open source, or what it means to be an open source advocate or an open source engineer over there. So how are we approaching this differently from like the existing community? So the open source organization, or in this case, Open Source Community Africa organization, is divided, or I would say, is driven by 2 pillars: the community side and the project side. Because again, I really hate slides. If you go over to github.com/collection, you're going to see a really interesting list called Made in Africa. And over in Made in Africa is a list called Made in Nigeria, where there are a bunch of open source maintainers that are in Nigeria or from Nigeria that have been able to build projects that are not just for social good, but also projects that company rely on, which is pretty cool. So one of the goals there was to be more intentional about working with engineers and telling them that, yeah, you can work on this thing on the side, or you can do this if you're bored. Again, that's how people create projects these days. But also be able to work with existing communities, like I said, like the other communities that are already existed, to be more focused about like what it means to build projects. So again, like I said, the community is divided into 2 sides, which is the chapter and the festival. So the chapter part is, again, a much smaller part of the community where we empower people within their cities to build conversations, projects, and also to host events, or in this case, smaller meetups. Why the festival is something like the State of OpenCon, which is a flagship event every year we launch, and bring over 1,000 people together. I'm sure Steven here is laughing because it was in the first ever open source festival in 2020, where we held, I think, close to 1,000 people in Lagos, Nigeria, and across multiple people all over Africa came over, which was pretty cool. So the goal there was to use the festival as a big event where people come in and then we share plans of like what we intend to do for each year. It was really nice until COVID happened, but before COVID happened, we somehow managed to pull the first ever open source festival, which was about, if my memory is not that terrible, 3 days before the lockdown, which was pretty close. Yeah. So, like I said, the festival was designed and we shared amazing ideas. I'm like, we want to do this. Like, we want to be able to push this event. We've been able to see this trend and we want to be able to be more intentional about it. Sure, and we're able to push that through our chapter programs on the community side. But again, as COVID happened, a lot of things was on the backlog side of things. So what we were able to do was to try to think about what does it mean to have virtual events? And now we're thinking about infrastructure in terms of internet. Because why it looks like, or I've seen multiple jokes on the internet, where it looks like, internet is or there's no available internet on some part of the continent. One thing that most people don't think about is how expensive it is to use internet over in Africa. And the reason I'm saying this is because I work for a couple US companies, and I'm kind of the only one in the company that has the most budget for internet connectivity because of how expensive it can be. So with those challenges, thinking about hosting a big event, or in this case, a smaller event around the continent, obviously we know for sure that the goal there, we're going to be able to lose some certain type of people. So what we did was we moved the festival and skipped that particular year. But then the cool thing we started pushing was on the project side, which is divided into the advocacy and the contribution side. So this is not necessarily, you're working with Oscar, but instead we're empowering you as your individual developers advocate or program manager to kind of like speak the gospel through your company or the initial initiative that you run. So yeah, what is the journey so far? I've been talking a lot. Again, like I said, in 2017, that was when the idea came. And I was eating jollof rice with, for some people that know what jollof rice is, I was eating jollof rice in Lagos when I was talking to my founder, Adaun Dukayo. She's a co-founder for She Code Africa. So we were actually having dinner and we're like, there's a lot of communities here. We want to do this. Like, what do you think? She was like, I think we should do this. We have no idea what we wanted to do, but we just wanted to push something. And in 2018, I remember I was working with my past life, I used to work with the government. So I was working with the government on my state at that time, and I was able to pull funding, and we were able to run the first dedicated open source event in a university in 2018. So that was technically when we started. And then just around 2018, we noticed that there was a lot of demand from different cities. So we're like, hey, we want this to happen in this city. And then obviously we started getting requests from other part of the continent, which we were like, we had no idea on how to expand it. So speaking about expanding, which is something I'm sure some of you might have heard a lot in your open source journey or doing OSPO, is funding, right? So now, again, like I said, having been in Africa, one of the biggest challenges there is to know that, hey, there's a lot of currencies, and moving money from one country to another country is a lot. And that's why there's a lot of fintech company in Africa trying to solve this challenge. So what happened, I came to London, which was interesting. I came to London to sustain OSS 2018, I remember. And then I met Pierre from Open Source Collective, and we had a chat. I was like, I'm trying to solve this problem, but I need one place where I can be able to talk to companies, individuals to donate or to work with us, but also an easy way that I can able to transfer money from one place than across. And that's how we registered in an open collective, or in this case, Open Source Collective as the fiscal host. And then again, in 2020, just like I said, we held the first ever Open Source Festival, and then eventually we expanded. In 2021, we did a lot of seed chapter programs, and of course, in 2020, we came back and did the next Open Source Festival, which was really massive. And again, this year, we're looking forward to the next one. But then, in 2023, the goal here is to, look into ways that we can not just do events, but also enable companies and organizations to work with us in terms of programs and initiatives. These are just kind of one of the highlights of what the festival looked like. It was a place in Lagos, on the mainland, for anyone that knows there very specifically. But then, again, why are we doing this? Like, why is Oscar here? The goal is, especially for the festival, the model here is to not just to network, but also to build sustainability and, of course, to build careers. Because the average engineer you most likely see in Africa is much, at least about 10 years younger than the person you see in the US or in Europe, which is very typical. So, and the reason for that is because the system is designed for you to be able to get your first job in your late 20s, but then that same system encourages you to finish college around just about 21, 22. So now the question that comes down to you, how do you get your first job when you're 21, when the company is asking for just about 10 years of experience, which is crazy. So again, the system here was to work with organizations that are willing to create contracts or hire from the continent, but also to bring them over. So we use the festival as a mechanism to, or again, as a strategy to attract companies to come sponsor and then, of course, enable them to talk to talent. Of course, like I said, and then COVID happened. Now, after COVID, it was crazy because we were not able to host in-person events anymore, but then we wanted to be able to reach out to a lot of people. So the ways we did that was to make sure that we sponsored not just our events, but also events that are across the common goal, which is, again, the general open source side. But of course, we were able to partner with existing organizations and projects that was already doing stuff around the open source space. So we were able to reach out to more people. And of course, amplifying through social media, which kind of really worked well. And then when it comes to the impacts, just around 2020 to 2022, because again, like I said, we started becoming more intentional in terms of tracking just around 2020. But again, these numbers is not necessarily reflecting on how much impacts that we're making. This is just because we wanted to show some data. So just around 2020, like I said, we held just around 1,000 people in person in Lagos, around 5 countries, and that countries means around 15 chapter leads were able to come down to Lagos. And then comparing 2020 to the next festival, which was I think in March 2020, we were able to pull just around 3.3K members around 9 countries, and then we expanded from just 15 places down to 54, which is really, really cool. Now, the thing about these numbers is, and of course, if you're looking at the State of Octoverse report from GitHub, especially in the last Octoverse in 2020, the numbers from Africa is growing really, really big. But now the problem about that is a lot of people are so hyped to go create a GitHub account because they know that that is one way that they can be able to hack their way into their first job, or maybe change career by, actively trying to increase the numbers of greens on your GitHub profile, because that feels like a way that recruiters can able to talk to you. But then the goal here is not just to make sure that, people go and register on GitHub and then learn a bunch of version control and all that, but to be able to build stuff, or again, to be able to mentor stuff. But then there are other programs, again, globally that are out there, like, for example, the Google Summer of Code, the Outreachy, some other initiatives that are out there. But then most of those initiatives there are not necessarily designed in the context of what we're trying to push. So what we did was we did some kind of an open source challenge by Oscar. I think at this one we did a collaboration with Meta or Facebook or whatever. I keep getting confused these days. Yeah. We did an initiative with Facebook, and the goal there was to get a bunch of their open source projects that they have, obviously like React and some other cool stuff they're working with, but them to be more intentional about getting contributors from Africa. So we were able to run this pilot for about, I think, a month. And then at the end of the day, like, there were a bunch of people that were even got approached by some recruiters to come work at Facebook. And then in terms of diversity, yes, while we're looking at diversity, the thing about diversity in Africa is pretty interesting, because we're not just looking at, the difference between genders, we're looking at language, we're looking at, cultures, and we're looking at even way of thinking, which is pretty interesting. And as much as I want to come here and discuss what Africa looks like, I barely have traveled less. I think I've traveled to more states in the US than I've done in Africa, which is not a proud thing to say, but again, I'm hoping to change. But one of the reasons for that is because it is just so expensive to travel across the continent, and sometimes, even getting visas can be a bit funny just around to travel within member states, which is crazy. But then one of the things we did there was to make sure that we worked with existing organizations. And one of them we did was She Code Africa. So She Code Africa is kind of like Women We Code, but in a much, much bigger scale and more focused in Africa. And we noticed that they were pushing a lot of, they were educating more women into technology, but we wanted to create a program between She Code Africa and Oscar to be more intentional about open source mentorship. So we're able to onboard about 100 ladies, and from that initiative, we had like someone really popular in the open source space called Ruth. I don't know how many of you know Ruth. Yeah, Ruth Okiga. Yeah. So she came out of that initiative, which was pretty cool. And then, of course, like I said, we worked with the Facebook Developer Circle program to help expand their open source immersive program, which was really, really awesome at that time. And then, just to kind of, again, to start to wrap up, the festival was really, really awesome. Again, getting companies, initiatives to talk about, hey, things on ways you can improve your network as a person, or in this case, like having to create something that people in Africa can go to and feel like the next open source summit rather than thinking about traveling. But then the most important part is to making sure that we are able to sustain what we're doing. So what we did was we partnered with Open Source Collective, which is one of the participation organizations with Sustain OSS. I don't know how many of you here have heard about Sustain OSS? Okay. So yeah, we created a version of Sustain OSS and we called it Sustain Africa. And the reason for that was because we wanted to have more intentional conversation that are more focused on the continent. And then the way we usually do this is just like the State of OpenCon, we always have an on-conference version of the conference that is more dedicated into Sustain, where we bring in industries leaders and open source contributors to come and talk about ways ways to sustain open source going forward. And we've done this about 3 years, I think, starting from 2020. Then we did one in 2021, I think just around December. And then we also did one in 2022 around the festival. Yeah, so this is kind of like an overview of what the Oscar effort has been going. You see a lot of West Africa because, again, it's just so easy for me to travel and some of my friends to travel. But then the goal here is to expand, especially on the northern part of the continent, which is something that we're still working on. But here the goal is to expand as much as we can. But we're not necessarily focusing about numbers or expansion. Rather, we're focusing about impact, which is something that we've been able to do for the last 5 years. And this is just kind of a random stat, which some of you might not really be happy about. But again, the Sustain OSS Africa, or in this case, Sustain Africa, one of the important things that we noticed was a lot of demand. Yes, Africa is growing really, really big in the contributions to open source, especially with the stats coming from GitHub. But then the goal here is about more intentionality on like things to do. So in the last 3 years, we've been able to work with organizations to create some special bounty programs. And how does that work? So we work with some companies with open source program office, or some companies that just want to do stuff around DevRel, which is making sure that we get their open source project and we work with closed groups where they get to select project they want to work on and then they get paid for the project. But then having to do that over the years, we realized that, this is something that we need to do over time. And that's how we started working on what it means to have our own bounty program. So again, we're hoping to work with a lot of companies and organizations, some we've already been talking to. But the goal here is to improve more hackathon this year. We've started some already. Currently, I think just in the next 2 to 3 weeks, there's something going to happen in Kenya where we're going to be hosting up to 100 people on the first version of it. But the goal here, again, the second goal is to make sure that we have the next festival coming up. We want to make sure that we have the biggest bounty program happening real time at the festival. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier, is making sure that we're more intentional about what it means to have mentorship programs and working with something that works well on the continent. So yeah, enough of the blabbing. So one of the ways that you can reach out to us is obviously going to the first link there is on the website. The second is on the festival. So the festival, we just announced the next open source festival, which is going to happen in June. We're hoping to host about 3K people in Lagos. We're hoping to expand that in other African countries once we sort out some things. But again, the festival is happening in June 22nd to 24th. And then if you want to learn more about what has been going on in terms of statistics and resources, you can go to the blog platform. The blog platform we self-hosted. And then, of course, if you want to do any direct partnership, you can email us at info@oscar.org. Or in this case, if you want to just see how we've been able to do things around finance, we're very transparent using the Open Source Collective platform. So you can check us out at the opencollective.org/Oscar. So thank you very much. And I don't know if anyone has any questions. Yeah, any questions? Okay.
Thanks. Oh, can you hear me? Good.
Yeah, I can hear you.
And apologies for my naivety, but my question is perhaps so you can help me. Who are the kind of big organizations or tech companies in Africa that are kind of investing or helping around this open source space and perhaps are helping you as part of this journey?
The way to phrase it is, so yes, there are a lot of companies that are rethinking what it is to do open source. So one of them, like I'm sure some of you heard about Andela, right? So Andela does have, I think, some kind of a DevRel / community section in the company where they work with engineers. Obviously, Andela train engineers. So they've been able to work with existing developers community, like I said, but not specifically open source, but more around, hey, we have this cloud platform that we want developers to use, or we will have this API that we want people to jump on. What are the ways that we can do that? Obviously, they send the dev advocate to do that. So smaller companies, again, the likes of like Flutterwave, Paystack, and some of the late startups have been able to do this by working with some developers community. But for us at Oscar, because we're so specific about like the open source part, and we don't really do sales and marketing, in quote, we mostly work with OSPO. So either advising companies locally or working with international brand. But we've been able to have some luck with the OSPO side because, again, there's like Google Office in some part of the continent and Microsoft and the rest. So we've been able to work with their local offices to be able to define what that means and all that. So, okay.
So I just want to say that I was a speaker at the first big event in 2020 before we all fell into the pandemic, and I'd just like to encourage that if you can get involved supporting the folks at Open Source Community Africa, that this is a fabulous group of people doing wonderful work. So I would encourage everybody that has any interest to get involved.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. There's a question.
Hi, I have come to this conference from a kind of academic research perspective. So do you have much kind of crossover with institutions, either, kind of educational or awareness raising around open source for perhaps students or people who are in academia?
Yeah. Actually, most of the open source contributors you would see on an average are students. So what that means are the average engineer is probably in the school. So that's why so GitHub does have, so GitHub, Microsoft, and I think Google does have a dedicated program that are in the university. So I think there's one called the Student Developers Club by Google, and then there's the GitHub side called the GitHub Campus Expert Program. So there are like a lot of initiatives that are already in universities, and we work a lot with universities a lot, so which is cool. Yeah.
That's great. One of the things I do is try and encourage people to share their code and be more open around code. So it's really great that can plug in.
So I know there's a trend right now in the US. I don't know about Europe, but there's a trend right now in the US where universities are thinking about what it means to do an OSPO, right? So I know we're not there yet, but it's something that we're beginning to like push because again, universities have been able to see what it means to be able to, open source stuff. So, yeah, second next person.
Hey, I was wondering a little bit about the audience. Maybe I missed this.
Sorry?
Was wondering about the audience a little bit more for Oscar Fest. Maybe I missed this.
Oh yeah, I didn't mention that. So yeah, so again, like I said, most of the folks you would see are mostly students in terms of numbers. But again, you're looking at people with different experience, but much, much younger. So, which is crazy because you probably see someone I don't know, average of 25 with like 6 years of software engineering experience.
Nice.
Which is crazy. So, yeah. I mean, I'm one of that kind of person. I've been in open source more than half of my life, which is crazy too. So, yeah, it's mostly because of the way things have been structured. Like you're told to go into university as early as possible, and you come out so early. But by doing so, you've been able to, contribute to projects. So, for example, I got into open source when I just finished grade school, like the OPC project. So I was much, much younger when I did that. So the average person you will most likely see does have that same experience.
Right.
Yeah.
What about international audience? Like, do you get people coming in internationally as well?
The 2020 we had, I think about 10% came out of the continent. But then I think it was much, much bigger this 2022 because we were able to expand and support more. Again, traveling down to Africa can be expensive. So we were able to do some collaborations with companies that were dedicated to sponsor people. But yeah, it is a really diverse group of people.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And I understood correctly, it's in Lagos in person?
Yeah, this festival is going to be in Lagos. I'm tired of doing it in Lagos, but next year or in the future, we're going to change the location. The reason we're doing it in Lagos is because we just wanted to try one more time because we skipped 2021 before moving into the next place.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah. There's something like that. Okay. Okay. So there's a...
Hi, Samson. Thanks so much for your talk.
Yeah.
I was wondering, as someone that works with an open source community, but has also done research and worked with folks that are working more on the connectivity side of things, as well as some people that are working more on open source hardware, I'm wondering what your relationship is or what the network building is like with the open source hardware, the open hardware community, as well as the connectivity community, especially as you were saying, given that connectivity is so expensive in your context.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say we do have like really great on the hardware side of things because I would say there are groups, like I said, right, there are existing communities that are doing things independently regardless of OSCA. What we usually do is just to make sure that we identify those communities and see the shared vision and work with them. So I think, yes, there are people building stuff. I mean, at the beginning of my career, I used to do a lot of hardware stuff. So, there are a lot of people doing that too. So, yeah.
Cool.
All right, thank you. Okay.
Obviously, we've kind of known each other for a while, and I wonder how your experiences of creating, and it's been a real journey, and it's impressive, creating the open source organization for Africa. How has that been when you don't have, let's say, that kind of more federated political organization that you don't have a European Union equivalent, or so how do you find creating your organization across all these different countries and there's different languages and are all the governments coming in and helping you, or are you doing it and the governments aren't there at all, or how is that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I'll try as much as I can to wrap it up because of the next speakers. Yes, there's an equivalent. There's an equivalent of the EU called the African Union. I've done some stuff with them before. It's fine. Yeah. Yes, but I would say yes, in terms of working with different countries, the model we use is, we don't want to come in and say, hey, we're an expert, right? We're like, oh, what is the existing thing that you're doing in your city or in your country is too big, like in your city that the community is doing. So, for example, 6 years ago, e-commerce used to be like a really hot topic in Nigeria. Now it's fintech, right? So it's like always trying to understand the trend of technology and working with the locals to say, hey, while you're working on these things, there's this overall thing that you can work on, right? Yes, that might, in this case, work with companies or initiate universities that may or may not have some government input. But I tried as much as I can, and this is me saying, maybe not my other teammates, I tried as much as I can to make it a non-governmental stuff. Yes, we may have worked with government, but we don't want to emphasize on doing that because we want to be as independent as possible.
Have you discovered new organizations or open source organizations that are in cities and countries that you never even knew existed, and through this work, you're bringing in all of these different groups?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's, again, like I said, I'm sure there are probably like 6 versions of Oscar that I probably don't know of somewhere, especially in Northern Africa because I haven't gone there before. I need to fix that. But yes, there are a lot of things going on. I think the most important part is, for us at Oscar, we don't really care much about whether you're under our umbrella. It's more like if you're advocating for open source in general, then that's a win. Because for us, that means that more companies can see what's going on. I mean, we want to be more intentional about the numbers that people are throwing out there and to make sure that we support as much people as possible. Yes, the goal is to be the organization that can talk to companies and get funding and then fund those other communities in the long run. So that's kind of what we're focusing on. So thank you. I know I need to step out. Yeah.